to introduce me like this. You hear me? You understand? You hear me? The sound is coming through?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Wonderful,
I mean,
yes.
Okay. As Martin Clausen last week already mentioned, this is sort of a project which Hans von Storch initiated, writing a book about, Hamburg climate science, actually about concepts which where Hamburg played a major role and which are still in use today. So it's a bit, and it's of course subjective, and especially this big topic which I've been commissioned. This big topic is, of course, I cannot, go into depth very much, but nevertheless, I hope to give you a bit of flavor of what happened and where Hamburg actually, science in Hamburg actually played an important role. I mean, the outline doesn't work. Yeah, the outline, I will sort of cover first, give a historical note and then talk about the early global carbon cycle models and then some complications which popped up, and then about the two major vehicles which were developed in Hamburg, the HAMOCC model and the HRBM model, which probably none of you remember or know, and then going into at the end into the coupled carbon cycle climate models. Now, most of you probably know about the greenhouse effect and who invented it, or who found out about it. It was sort of Joseph Fourier who was the first. But then what most people do not know still is that actually the person who figured out that CO2 is a greenhouse gas was actually a woman, Eunice Newton-Foote, who was forgotten. I mean, she made a smart experiment with glass vials, which she put out into the sun and measured the temperature, which increased in this when there was CO2 present, but also when there was water vapor present. She made it's a very simple experiment, but she showed indeed, and then she knew immediately the consequences of this work. In fact, here is sort of the paper which was then published, which I hope you can see, and what you see is that she wrote already in that little paper, an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature. And if, as some suppose, at one period of its history, the air had mixed with it a larger proportion than at present, an increased temperature from its own actions as well as from increased weight must have necessarily resulted. Not sure about the weight, but nevertheless about the concentration. So she was aware of this, but this got forgotten, and the person which is usually credited for really measuring the infrared properties of CO2 was John Tyndall. And then Svante Arrhenius is considered the first who really calculated quantitatively how much CO2, how much global mean average temperature. And Arrhenius actually also had then, discussed already the anthropogenic perturbation or potential anthropogenic perturbation, but he actually wasn't scared at all. In fact, he wrote that this is in German. This is in his book from 1903. He wrote that actually that most of the CO2 which we humans put into the atmosphere will be taken up by the ocean, and only 1/6 will remain in the atmosphere. And he writes, die Kohlensäuremenge in der Luft würde demnach in 54 Jahren etwa 1/100 zunehmen, was wohl durch genaue Analysen festgestellt werden könnte. And you can actually calculate it. I use this with my students usually, what is with these numbers. But indeed, 57 years later, it was really actually detected that CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing, but it was more than Arrhenius' calculation. Arrhenius' calculation would sort of imply after 54 years a CO2 concentration of 297 ppm, whereas observed is about something like 312. So that's the kind of problem, and most of you probably know about this. These were the first measurements which taken at Mauna Loa on the top graph, and the South Pole and the bottom graph, where you see in the South Pole, especially you see the increase over these 2 or 3 years where these first measurements were published by Dave Keeling from La Jolla. And these measurements have taken up, and you probably all have seen this many times. One has to, in such a talk, one has to show this graph, that there's rising CO2 since these early measurements at the very beginning, which have reached now over 400 ppm, 410 ppm, and it's still increasing, So that's the kind of observational evidence which was already available in the late 50s or early 60s, published, and then continued to be published in several publications. So it was, this increase was already apparent. And then, of course, one question was then, what was before? And that's where ice core measurements help very much. And you see now here, this is sort of an older graph where the direct measurements are in red, the red points from 1960 or 58 onwards. And on the left-hand side, you see also the blue points. These are ice core measurements since, actually much before. You can actually go much before, and we know this. I will come back to the ice core measurements in a moment. And you see that it looks like it's an anthropogenic perturbation. I mean, because it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. And of course, this implied that you have to, if you want to understand this and how it's going on and predict it into the future, then you need a model. You need to somehow calculate it. And obviously, Arrhenius made a mistake because he only predicted a very small increase and said only 1/6 of the CO2 will remain in the atmosphere. He thought about the long-term changes in atmospheric CO2, and he forgot about the fact that it actually takes time to equilibrate the atmospheric CO2 with the ocean. Hence, if you want to take that into account, then you need to somehow model the ocean a bit more sophisticatedly. And that's sort of early models, which were in the 70s, relevant. That's the time when I was also getting into this business as a student, working with these kind of models, which just have a few boxes. Atmosphere and even a small land biosphere was sort of sometimes included, but it's mostly the atmosphere, and the ocean, maybe 1, 2 boxes. There were some with maybe a few more. And on the right-hand side, you actually see the Swiss model with which I was working very much. That there they represented the ocean as a simple vertical diffusion reservoir mixed by eddy diffusion, eddy processes. And so you have a few parameters which you have to tune. And in order to make, to simulate the observations, in particular the atmospheric CO2. And now the problem is with these models they're highly aggregated carbon reservoirs and highly parameterized, and they focused primarily on the atmosphere-ocean system. The land biosphere was sort of considered a small residual with some tuning of parameters, was not really considered an important player. And what is also critical is that it's mostly these models are primarily linear or small, have some small non-linearity because of the ocean chemistry, which was very well known already at Arrhenius times. And but that was sort of, they're still relatively almost linear. And critical is the atmospheric CO2 increase is almost exponential. And that meaning you have no discrimination between different models. If you only consider the atmospheric verification of the atmospheric CO2 increase. And so one additional piece of information which was very critical at that time was the radiocarbon, because radiocarbon is, produced naturally in the upper troposphere. and low stratosphere, and it's sort of percolating in the carbon cycle, and then it's a radioactive decay. So therefore, you can when you measure it in different reservoirs, you can actually somehow figure out something about the transfer of this radiocarbon from the top into the different reservoirs. And then there was also the bomb experiments, at the times when atmospheric atom weapon tests were taking place. They produced also a lot of radiocarbon, which was also like a pulse experiment distributed in the system. And that is still now an important piece of information, but at that time, this was critical. But it was clear already at that time that, these simple models do not, you will have to go a step further and actually bring it into the physics of the climate system. And there was a famous seminal, study, which was coordinated by or organized by Bert Bolin and a few colleagues, among them Klaus Hasselmann, which took place in 1974 in Stockholm, where a lot of sort of old players of climate science, among also Dave Keeling and Crutzen and a lot of them were taking place, and they wrote an important document which actually outlines, the steps towards comprehensive climate and also comprehensive carbon cycle climate models. It's quite an interesting piece. And they noticed also this exponential problem, that the exponential forcing. And they say that simple geochemical models can depict this, the observed, sort of the exchanges between the different big reservoirs. But since they're almost linear adjustments to the global carbon, all these models are able to make useful predictions up to about the year 2000. But once you go beyond simple exponential increase, then, of course, the dynamics of the system matter. And then also comes the next step, that is the, if climate changes the system, the physical system, like the transport in the ocean, or impacts the land biosphere, then, of course, you will have differences in the uptake, and then the linear model will no longer work. And indeed, when you take this is sort of, I took the Oeschger model from Bern, and ran it here, with the parameters of that time. I mean, so that was the publication was in 74, and you run it. It does a good job in sort of predicting with the actual emissions, and it does a good job in predicting the observed CO2 concentration. So that was the state at the end of the 70s, sort of. And then came two major complications. And one was this paper by Woodwell and others, where they basically said that, well, the biosphere is not just taking up CO2 or is a small residual, but it's actually a major player in the system. They estimated huge amounts of CO2 emitted from changes in land use, in particular deforestation. They came up to values, on this scale, up to 18 petagrams carbon per year, which is, of course, we know that is not correct. But at that time, there was a major impact on the society, on the community. And then immediately how to reconcile this means that you have to invoke land uptake as well. Otherwise, because the ocean uptake, one was, because of the radiocarbon knowledge, one was sort of convinced that works. So this was sort of the starting point where a lot of biologists, ecologists, and so on started to come into the field. Before it was mostly atmospheric people and oceanographers who looked into the carbon cycle. And the second major complication was the ice core measurements. I mentioned this already before. The first measurements of lowered atmospheric CO2 during the last glacial in the cold phases was, where they came out in 1980. There's a French group and a Swiss group. They both published practically at the same time. And they showed that indeed the CO2 was around 200 ppm or even 180 ppm before, during the last cold phase, and only in the Holocene, in the warm phase, was about 280, which before the Industrial Revolution. And this was a major finding. And of course, if you want to explain this, then you need a coupled model where you have the climate included and the carbon cycle included. And this is the kind of picture we have now in mind. We see these big corresponding fluctuations between CO2, methane, and the temperature as recorded in these glacial cycles, in the ice cores over the glacial cycles. So that actually made a big change in how we view the system. In the classical view, when I took lectures at Bern, it was sort of the view that the sun provides the energy input, then we have the physical climate system, and the physical climate system dominates the environment of the land and ocean ecosystems. And since especially since this finding from the ice cores, we know now that it's actually also turning around. There is a feedback, because these ecosystems, if they lose carbon or methane, greenhouse gases, they can change the physical system. So that was sort of an important paradigm shift which happened there. And another component also from this GARP report, there was already mentioned, that this, of course, the problem is it's a different timescales which you have to look at. And Hasselmann showed this nice picture here, where he was discussing mostly the techniques of how to couple ocean and atmosphere, because with a model you can only represent a certain time window or time scale window, and which you have to deal. But he also mentioned here the biosphere included, and that's the job of the carbon cycle. So this is a system which we need to address. It's in a simple way, it just looks like this. You just have the three fast carbon cycle components, which are the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. And they are, on one hand, they are modified by the emissions, the direct emissions into the atmosphere from humans, but then also the changes in land use, deforestation, and so on, which changes the system. So that's the direct forcing of the carbon cycle. And then because CO2 and also methane, but primarily CO2 is a greenhouse gas, it changes the climate, and then there is a feedback. That's these black arrows on the left-hand side. And it's this, which is still, and I will come to that, still relatively unknown. So if you want to understand the system, there are two main overarching carbon cycle questions, which I've sort of picked up, here for this remainder of this talk. One is, of course, what is the magnitude of the climate carbon cycle feedback under a transient greenhouse gas emissions over the next 200, 100, 300 years? That's the key question which one wants to understand in the context of global warming. Will including a carbon cycle in the system, how will that modify the response in terms of temperature, and of course in all kind of climate parameters, but also of course carbon cycle parameters. And then the other one is, of course, what is the key mechanism leading to the low atmospheric CO2 during the cold phases of the glacial cycles? These two questions were already prevalent at the time when I came then eventually also to Hamburg. Well, actually it was a little bit before, and that's when, in Hamburg, the first main contribution was the Hamburg model of the ocean carbon cycle, HAMOCC, which was built by Ernst Maier-Reimer, where he basically put the carbon component, first just the inorganic carbon, dissolved inorganic carbon, and which has just chemistry, which is very well known at the surface, and gas exchange with the atmosphere. And it's just put this underneath an atmosphere or a box, an atmosphere box in the early part. And then you just because the ocean currents are computed from in this case, in the early case, from the LSG model, and the ocean mixing basically then simulates, the uptake of carbon. If you add now CO2 into the atmosphere, you can then change the uptake of the ocean. And here is sort of on the left-hand side, one sees a bit, how at that time on the in the lowest panel, you see the observations, which were not very comprehensive at that time, but nevertheless, we knew that there is outgassing in equatorial regions and uptake a bit higher up, and that's the model predicts this, because of its own circulation structure. That was really the first. I mean, that was really the very first three-dimensional ocean uptake model. It's still a simple one because it didn't include biology, ocean biology. Indeed, that was then immediately. I mean, there was Bob Bacastow, a co-worker from Dave Keeling, came to Hamburg and worked with Ernst, and he basically then together they basically implemented then relatively simple, but nevertheless they implemented the ocean biology. It's sort of nicely depicted here. This is a seminal picture which many people show, was also in IPCC, that was made by Christoph Heinze, which was at that time a PhD student on the Ernst. Very nice. And with this, so these components to the right, the biological pumps, they are the additions which Bob Bacastow together with the group implemented. And one can ask, this model, and it has not so many parameters to fit, because the transport of the mixing is really done by the physics, And then one can ask, can one actually with this then also look already at the glacials, at the cold system? And indeed, that was Christoph's PhD work mostly, but they had a very seminal paper in 1991 where they basically already investigated different mechanisms with this relatively simple model in order to lower the atmospheric CO2. So they just took the ocean atmosphere system and changed parameterizations. And then they also looked not just at the CO2, but also at a lot of other, not any scenario is possible. Because there are also ocean data from sediments, isotopes and so on. And they looked at that and sort of selected sensitivity experiments only which are in qualitative agreement with marine observations, And so they came up with this nice, upper graph where you see the reduction of CO2 during the cold phase compared to pre-industrial. From the observations, we know it's about 80 ppm, but then the different mechanisms it's difficult to make it. The different mechanisms potentially could contribute, but not all together. And on the bottom is what the state of the art today of looking at this in the ocean. On the bottom is the same, almost the same graph, which from IPCC. From AR5, I think Victor Brovkin made this. It's really beautiful. It shows you the different or key mechanisms, like the state, what does the temperature, what do the salinity change from glacial to interglacial, iron fertilization, ocean circulation is included, which of course in the old simulation was only with very simple parameterizations. They tried to also look into that. And and what one sees is, the bottom bar, the yellow bar shows that actually it was this 80 or 90 ppm reduction. By a single mechanism, you cannot make it. You need, if you want to use ocean as a driver of the low CO2. So with a single, you need a complicated story, and that's, I think, but I might not be fully aware of it. I think that's still the case today. The other question was the feedback into the future. Now, Ernst made this graph here. I remember he came to me in my office where he showed, that one can represent at least the almost linear response of when you put in CO2 in the system, and then it's taken up by the model. You can express it as a convolution equation if it's fully linear, but even if it's semi-linear, it works like that. And he showed this graph because he thought that now he has an ocean uptake model, which is now based on physics, that it is must be quite different than the box model. But indeed, here in this graph, the dashed line is the box model. And you should look at the graph A, that's with a very small perturbation, because if you put in a big perturbation, then you would go to graph C, line C, because then the chemistry plays a role and reduces the ocean uptake. And he came to me and said he was very disappointed that he gets almost the same as the box diffusion model, which just has a few parameters. Anyway, but you can use this, and then of course this is just a linear response where the ocean circulation remains constant. And of course, the next step and the interesting step is then to go into the situation where the ocean is also changing. And that's, he published this a few years later, the group where they basically found out that actually, if you just have the ocean atmosphere system, the feedback is small. In that paper, I mean, the feedback is small. They found substantial uptake of the ocean, CO2 uptake, but that's just a physical chemical process of inorganic carbon pushing down, whereas changes in the marine biology and also changes in the circulation, which is sort of in the top graph, right? A deep water formation in the North Atlantic was relatively small in their simulation, and export production goes down a little bit, but it's a small feedback, and one can compare it with today, and indeed it is relatively small. The ocean climate feedback is small, and that's what is shown here is sort of, one can describe these feedbacks with this beta and gammas formulation, which was Pierre Friedlingstein developed in the early 2000s, where you basically express the uptake capacity of a reservoir with this beta factor, which shows you how much more carbon is taken up by that reservoir per ppm increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's the fertilization, if you want, or the sink uptake. And the gamma describes the other effect, that how much carbon is changed when you increase the temperature, the global temperature, by 1 degree. You can analyze 3D coupled carbon cycle climate models with this, and you can then look at these gammas and betas. And on the bottom is the latest, that's from the CMIP6 simulations, where you see that on the left-hand side, you see the betas for the ocean, and you see, of course, it's about, if you take these bars with the different configurations, and each point is a different model simulation. There are now many models who do this kind of simulations, and you see that sort of a 0.8 or so is so 0.8. The uptake capacity of the ocean is 0.8 petagrams carbon per ppm increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's on a time scale of about 100 to 200 years. One has to be, these betas and factors, they are time scale dependent. And on the right-hand side is the gammas. And the gammas are about minus 10, maybe minus 10, meaning that the ocean takes up less if it's warmed under a warming. And you can also take the old Ernst's calculation, and you see that his model is actually, it's a bit taking up a bit more CO2. The beta ocean is 1.2 when you take his numbers, and the gamma ocean is minus 13. So, well, well in the, under the presidency. So not so much has changed. Regarding this. Now, the next, I want to now come to the biosphere. The land biosphere I mentioned before, it was considered negligible, but with the ice core data and also with these big emissions from land use changes, of course, also modeling the biosphere became a very important piece of carbon cycle research. And in Hamburg, that was also, it was not really Hamburg only, but it actually had a collaboration which Klaus Hasselmann made with Helmut Lies from Osnabrück. And Helmut Lies had a co-worker, Gerd Esser, who worked with the model which Helmut Lies originally developed. And Gerd Esser came along many times to Hamburg and explained his model, which is sort of basically a geographically global model, which is some, he called it high resolution biosphere model. High resolution meaning, I don't know, 2 by 2 degrees or something like that. But it included already the climate of the different parts of the globe as as defining the parameters which then calculate the carbon exchanges at each grid point. And each grid point had its own carbon box, and was calculating it. And it's the wiring diagram is a bit complicated. But he also made already experiments like response of this over the history of the since the Industrial Revolution, and also then even on changing the global temperature and things like that. And he also looked already at some simulation of the past. They took ECHA model simulation of a presumably glacial, which at that time were still relatively not so well, relatively simple, but they forced this model with this, and they checked how much carbon was changed, how much carbon the land could now take up or would emit. And in fact, they found, or one of the key messages out that his model is really driven by the fertilization factor. Only when you put in the CO2 fertilization, which I will come back in a moment, then indeed, you get a lowering of, well, actually, then you make a big difference between how much carbon is stored on land versus in the cold phase versus the pre-industrial. And you can do also these feedback analysis and compare with present-day models. And I must say the present-day models are much more wider in terms of they have betas and gammas, which are much more spread than for the ocean. So it's a much more difficult problem to simulate the response of the global carbon cycle on land to changes in atmospheric CO2 versus changing of the climate. And here, I mean, his numbers are a bit sort of, his this model has a much too high CO2 uptake compared to present-day crop of coupled models, and also a very small sensitivity to changes in temperature. It's only of 3, whereas average changes of temperature are about 50 or so petagrams carbon per degree warming, loss of carbon. So one can sort of see this, but on land, the main problem on land, and that is now getting towards the summary, is that it's the key issue is the CO2 fertilization effect. And we made a synthesis paper very recently. I was involved by Walker. It was published a few years ago, and where we looked at the evidence on all different timescales and systems, ecosystems, measurements, also global measurements, and so on, trying to estimate this kind of the strengths of this feedback of the CO2 fertilization effect. And unfortunately, it's still a big range, And if you actually go into there and compare the HRBM model from Esser it is a bit on the fertile side, but not so much. But what is also sobering is that these biosphere models, they don't have nutrient limitations, at least for a long time now. They start to become, there are now models which have at least nitrogen in it, but also phosphorus should be taken into account. And they don't use any land, and they don't have land use and land management in it, or not really in a comprehensive way. In fact, that kind of model which Esser built, is really only one step towards the present day coupled carbon cycle climate model, and it's sort of illustrated a bit in this graph here, because you actually needed to bring in 3 communities which were working on different timescales and on different types of problems. And one was the short term, basically, essentially, evaporation processes, evaporation and also water exchange processes between leaves and atmosphere, boundary layer. This part, that's a community by itself. The green part is sort of the intermediate, that's sort of the biogeochemical feedbacks, basically actual accounting for where the carbon is stored and how it's allocated between the plants and transported and eventually respired back into the atmosphere. That's the part which Esser was addressing. And then there is yet another level, another complexity which one has to deal with, and that has to do when climate is changing. You also have vegetation changes, moving vegetation composition changes. And we know that the trees can grow in warmer areas or can move, tree line can move and so on. And that's the biogeographical community. And they have, each community of these had models. And then there are sort of 3 early ones, which I can think of, which were published around in the same time, around in the late 90s, or in the 90s, so before the year 2000. And it was to bring these together into one single model, which was the challenge. And that was the group who made this first was Peter Cox and his group, so the Hadley Center group, which came up with the very first fully coupled global carbon cycle climate model simulation. And they showed that indeed the climate effect, the climate feedback is important, especially with a lot of the Amazon dying back, when it gets too warm because of drier, it gets drier and warmer Amazon. So the land effect is, of course, the bigger one. That's also visible when you look at these feedback parameters, which I showed before. It is evident, the land uptake processes are much more vulnerable, to changes in climate. And in Hamburg, it also took a few more years until the very first simulation, which was published in 2007. That was to my knowledge, the very first coupled Hamburg version of the Hamburg model. Now, we're still with the HAMOCC model on the ocean side and for ocean carbon cycle side, and on the land, the J.S. Bach model, which was built between Jena, Hamburg, and actually Lund, Potsdam, what is it? I forgot. Jena. Anyway, it's Jena was involved in it, but in a joint collaboration, and that is sort of now the workhorse, provide a workhorse for the next kind of studies. So let me finish with a few just personal thoughts on this story. I cannot be comprehensive. I think that there has been significant Hamburg efforts on the way to these coupled carbon cycle climate models. There was a contribution. In fact, the very first ocean uptake model with a 3D ocean model was a really first, And when you now look the history since then, as there is much, the carbon cycle components have become, now a standard component of Earth system models. Most modeling groups worldwide have now a carbon cycle component included. And what is also seen is that the complexity of the carbon cycle representation has massively increased, which is a bit discomforting, I find, because one forgets the big picture. And look at the global carbon budget publication, which every year comes out, it gets bigger and bigger. Nobody reads this from end to end, anymore. It's like IPCC reports, you forget the key messages, the key first order processes, because I think on centennial scale, the first order processes controlling the carbon budget, carbon cycle climate, even the carbon cycle climate feedbacks are relatively well understood, at least regarding the ocean. And but also, I think also with land, we have now enough data to show this, but it's a 10 to 20% effect. But there is, of course, the fundamental problem that on land we have empirical formulations. There's no fundamental theory behind it. And I think if you look into the future, the key factor for assessing the 21st century is really the land use and land management, which right now is still in the models very rudimentary represented. I think what we do with the land, humans are everywhere now modifying the land, cutting down trees or making agriculture, having pasture, fertilizing, watering, and that is happening so much that this will dominate the land, at least on the land side, the response of the system. And paleo, well, the story is still tantalizing, and I do not think that it's fully understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much.